Hello, welcome back to the Astroflower. This is the second in the series of the rhythms of life. In the Astroflower, we talk about the solar cycles and how it affects us where you, or when more like, you are born in the solar cycle. We look at it through four different situations: in high solar activity, in transitional downwards, in low activity, and transitional upward. And we will be going into that at the end of this class. But let's just get a bit of a history on solar cycles. Now, solar cycles, roughly around about sort of 11 years in cycle. I've got it down to 10.56 on an average, I think, years. So it gives us a sort of generational sort of idea of a solar cycle. If we look back right in history, in the Egyptian history, they've got certain gods which are associated, or goddesses, which are associated with war, but also with fertility. And obviously they are also connected to the sun. Often, Egyptian wars were sometimes fought for the idea of fertility within within the Egyptian culture. And this can be seen I will provide links in the description below. This can be seen by many studies. For example, the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. It can be said that being born in a solar maximum period also significantly reduces fertility for women born in poorer categories, but not for wealthier women or men, said by the authors. So we show for the first time that not only infant survival and lifespan can also fertility is statistically associated with solar activity at birth. So this is where we get into the idea that if you are born at a particular time of solar activity, may predict your life expectancy. I think this has to do with more sort of infant deaths rather than the long duration of your life, simply because there is so many factors that go into that I don't think there is a strong correlation between that. But obviously, if you're born in a particular time of a life cycle, solar cycle, you may find in that period there that infertility deaths were higher than in high cycles, basically. So there is this sort of connection between fertility and fertility of humans as well during high and low cycles. There are quite a few studies made on this activity, or on this aspect. So therefore, it correlates to the Astroflower and how we position the high cycle, the transitional, the descent transitional, the low cycle, and the increased transitional back up towards the high cycle. So this is noted in many different sort of studies. There is also studies which connect to crops throughout the history, where we have this is a solar cycle here, as you can see here, and on some of them you have one peak of a solar cycle, and some of them you have two peaks, and what is called a double cycle, double height cycle. For the current studies, so 108 years of data were used, and which correlated between 10 single and 5 double sunspot cycles, and yields were analysed for various phases of these cycles. Statistical tests were used in some cases to compare the average yield for a given stage of the cycle with the overall mean or with some other stage. Sorry, I'm just reading off the scientific papers here that have been giving out, and I can give you, as I say, the links will be in the description below. Firstly, lower than average yields are associated with low solar cycles, sunspot cycles. And secondly, lower than average yields are especially connected with slow solar activity. So therefore, during low solar activity, and this lasts for approximately around about sort of 3 years, just over 3 years, 2.5 years, sorry, just over 2.5 years, roughly around about 3 years, we can see that in lower cycles there is low production, and in higher cycles, the higher the negatively plotted double sunspot cycle produces higher yields. And there is one other point that was considered. Thirdly, the higher yields, higher than average yields, are associated with high sunspot activity. Okay, so this shows maybe also within the fertility of crops that can be found, and also potato famines are associated with solar cycles as well, and that sort of thing. It's a study that's ongoing, shall we say, but it's been a long time sort of an interest to the human race, and all throughout history, even within the Mayan tribes, within the Chinese history, who used to watch sunspots around about, I think it was 2,000 years ago. I'll have to check that out. Through when they had sandstorms, you could see the sun and you could actually see the dots on the suns, and they started reporting it around about then, a long time ago. And these cycles can actually breed into cultural revolutions and also cultural advancements. So as we go through time, we can see on some aspects of solar cycles. So the American Revolution was at the height of the solar cycle, and so was the Great French Revolution, so was the Cuban Revolution, and so was the Russian Revolution. And there's many wars that have been fought, particularly on high cycles. Obviously, you have the cycle of the First and Second World War, which came after a much lower section of cycles that reduced just before the 1900s, in the 1880s, just after the peak of solar activity, just before that in 1859, 1860. So it started reducing from the 70s, 80s, 1900s, and 110, and leading right up to the 1920s and 30s, where there was a slight pickup on the solar activity. But this bred us into a situation where frustration might have been a case, in particular for the First and Second World War, due to the solar cycles that were going on at that period, that was leading everything up to it. There seems to be, it appears, and this is my observation, it appears to be a lag in time. So as the solar cycle comes through the sun, the knock-on effect on the human existence on planet Earth is around about sort of between 5 and 15 years in lag of that. And it can be shorter than that. And as we've progressed in time, and technology is also progressing, so we're getting better data out of the solar cycles, we can start seeing that that there is a connection maybe to fashion and mods as we go through. So in the 1960s, when we're going into the human rights movements, also the hippie movement, and etc., there was high solar activity, and one of the highest within the 20th century, that period there, where it led up to just before that in 1960 to 65, there was high activity, And then the low activity started in around about sort of 1964, 65, I guess. And then we had another sunspot cycle that accumulated in the 1970s. And this is where the human rights sort of came in. So after the joyous part of the early part of the 1960s, and that enthusiasm that was brought into our culture, at the end of the 1960s, in 1970s, the solar cycle, as you can well see, is a much lower cycle. And this may have bred that sort of idea of frustration within the population across the globe, because within 1968 as well, you had the May revolutions, uprisings in France as well, as much as you had the Summer of Love and the I think it was the race riots. I'm not sure if you can call it the race riots, but the human rights sort of movements started around that sort of period. And the solar cycle wasn't very strong. It was quite weak. And then after that, following that, we had the punk cycle that came out of that. That was born out of that frustration with society. From there, in the 1980s and through the 1990s, right through to the year 2000, we had a very high section of solar cycles, which created a lot more optimism about the world. And this is where globalism sort of happening. Big trades started happening. Everybody was a merchant banker and the yuppie movement that came out of it. And that whole electronic age, in a way, or the computer age, started giving birth to that moment there. It plays out from one cycle to the other. And from the year 2000, and this is where we come up to sort of economic sort of situations as well. Let me just bring up that chart, sorry. Yeah, the economic cycle that was happening in the year 2008 was the end of those boom years which we had from the 1980 right through to 2000 and 2008. And from that moment on, things started heading south, shall we say. And we had solar cycle 24 that was a lot less active. And that was going through right through to 2020. It's been picking up since. That was the low point of the cycle. And that's been picking up since the 2020, where we had obviously what we've been through over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. It seems like there's going to be, it seems like there's a lot more activity upon the sun, but less in the direction of going towards the Earth. Now, we've seen this in the past, in the very long past, and this is where we're going to get into slightly longer rhythms within the solar activity. There's a thing called the Maunder minimum, which happened approximately between 1650 and 1700. And if you go back even further still, let me just bring that one up. If you go back further still, there is a slight downturn that's sort of happening around about the Dark Ages, which starts around about sort of 800, I think, 800 in Europe. And they say the Dark Ages go from 800 through to 1400. And then we started going from 1400, 1500, and started going into what we call the Renaissance period. And this is when the sun basically had died, had stopped producing solar activity and solar cycles for a period of around about 50 years. And some people say that we're moving back into that period again. I think there is something to be said for that, that's for sure. And it was a time when, say, like the Thames, the river that runs through London, froze over and markets were reported to be held upon the ice because it was so thick and so cold. And there is major connection between the solar cycles and climate. And there's been many, many studies on that concerning the climate activity, which you can find out on the internet if you do your own research. So from this, out of the 1650 going through to the 1700, This is that ending of the Renaissance period. And that is what they're saying, is that the sun is being reborn at that moment. And as it's reborn, then the solar cycles then start kicking back up and start coming back into play, as it were. So we can see these in shorter cycles, and we can see it also in longer cycles. Now, this is where we get into the galactical cycle. Now, the galactic cycle is around about sort of 24 to 24,000 years, roughly speaking, give or take a few hundred years. As I've been saying, and many people have been saying, it's not just me, lots of people have been saying that we're going through this galactic current sheet, the magnetic current sheet of the galaxy that we're in. If you imagine, it's like a disk, and the Earth goes up and down, or the solar system goes up and down through that galactic thing as it goes through it. It actually goes through it probably 4 times in the 24,000 year cycle. The main periods are on either 0-24, one of those two, like a 24-hour clock, and also 12, its opposite. On the other cycles, we get 6 and 18. They seem to be less important or less profound, although, human culture did start, recorded human culture started around about sort of 6,000 years ago, or modern culture started around about sort of 6,000 years ago with the Egyptians and the Sumerians and their tablets and etc. And also the Sanskrit texts and etc. So this longer cycle is affecting the Earth and affecting the cycles that's happening to us on a sort of much more than generational sort of period. How does it affect us as individuals? So coming back to the Astroflower and how the solar cycle affects us from when we're born, we talked earlier on about fertility, also health issues that can be affected, like heart conditions, and also brain activity, so depression and etc. And also heightened brain activity as well, which also could lead into the idea of these revolutions and etc. that all sort of happen on the solar heights, as it were. And it will affect us within a generation. So depending on when you are born, if you are born in the height of solar activity, I have equated that within the Astroflower as being a optimistic, because I'm eternally optimistic. It could also be incredibly frustrating because of that optimism. There's nothing worse than a youth that believes they have the key to the universe and want to impose it upon the rest of society that's already been through lots of solar cycles and lots of epochs. Yes, it's a changing thing and ever developing, and we should most certainly listen to the younger generation. There's no doubt about it. And we should, every generation should be taken into consideration, as much as the younger generation should listen to the older generation. That will give them pearls of wisdom of the time that they have led through these solar cycles. So if you're born at the height of a solar cycle, I've said they're very much more sort of extrovert, or sort of optimistic in a way. Then we have the transitional descent part of the cycle. If you're born in that, it's more of a case of half glass empty and half glass full. So this is a real sort of go-between, it's almost like mutables. Really, you could say that the height of cycle would be cardinals. The descent could be more sort of mutables, and the low cycle is more sort of fixed. As I say, it's much more a case of, on the descent, it's much more of a case of half glass empty and half glass full. There is a reason for this, because on the heightened bit, when we're moving towards the height, the solar maximum and the high activity, that's more of a case of half glass full, half glass empty. There's a slight differentiation, a slight orientation, as it were, And these parts of the solar cycles tend to be shorter in period. So the height cycles and the low cycles tend to last a little bit longer in time than the descent or the ascent, as it were. Low cycles, I would say, is more sort of introvert. This is where we look inwards, and we construct a lot. We build a lot. It's a lot more consistent, a lot more maybe authoritarian in a way within the lower part of the cycle. And this can sort of happen. This can have an effect upon you as an individual. As you go forward through life, you can see where, if you are born in the high cycle, where your natural rhythms hit these high cycles going forward. Therefore, you should be able to correlate that with the sort of activities you should be doing, or the sort of things that you might want to be exploring in your life, and understanding the sort of the reason why we do certain things in life, like moving house, like changing jobs, like having children, creating that album that becomes the #1 seller, that sort of thing. We can understand certain aspects of these rhythms that play out in the human life. And this will be affected by our social conditioning that is around us. So if we do get traumatized at certain particular times in certain rhythms, they are going to be affecting us going forward. And once we understand them, we can see them within the future solar cycles. If we might be having a few problems there, might being a little bit more frustrated simply because our human cycle is a little bit whacked out, as it were. So this can play a major effect of how we plan our life going forward. And this will be in the third video of this masterclass on rhythms of the Astroflower. So that will be coming up afterwards. I hope this has given you a good sort of background information about where we are at the moment. And I keep going into sort of pole shift energy. And this is going through that galactic plate at the moment. Everything seems to be coming together. All the rhythms seem to be coming together at like one point of a recalibration of the entire system. And as we do go into that, it's flushing out a lot of things within the human race. So I would let go of the normal society if I was you. Concentrate on your path. You will meet the people around you that correspond to you. So collectively, we can build a brighter future out of a logical understanding of how things go forward. That third class will be coming up. I will see you then. In the meantime, don't forget, life should be fun, so please do enjoy.